made a dresser. Here it is. If you want to see how I did it, watch the video. So at the beginning of any project, one of the things that you want to do is pick your wood. Of course, lots of people obsess about grain direction, color matching. You want your boards to all look the same so things don't look out of place. One of the things that I've found that really helps speed up the process when you're trying to select which wood to use is just procrastinate until the very last minute, and then grain selection becomes less of an issue. Speaking of grain selection, some of you may have noticed me make my first mistake already. When I originally designed this piece, I was going to paint it, and so I wasn't really too concerned about grain direction. Once I got it built, I realized that I kind of liked the way it looked, and there's a couple things that aren't quite right with the grain. However, I think it's a worthwhile compromise, and I think it turned out pretty good. So when working with rough lumber, everything starts with the same basic steps. First you lay out your parts, kind of break it down into rough size, and then flatten it out on a jointer, run it through the planer to give you a parallel side on the other side, and then run it through the table saw, and that gives you a 4 square piece of wood that you can build your project out of. What you saw me doing there was resawing thicker boards into thinner boards so I can use the right thickness for the design that I have in mind. The reason I did that rather than just using already thinner boards is I had the 2-inch thick stuff on hand, and it's stuff that I milled up myself. So it has some sentimental value, and since I'm building this for my daughter, I just want that connection. And so back to milling. So what we have here is everything milled to the right thickness. Now to run it through the table saw, and then it'll be the right width. Just a quick note, when you're making furniture, it's not often that the exact measurement is critical. What's important is the fact that things are consistent. So using a stop block like this allows you to get repeatable cuts and everything is the same length. That way everything lines up square. Anyway, on with building. So while making videos for YouTube, I've discovered that it's important to use your most expensive tools. That way you can show them off and make other people feel jealous. After all, that's the whole point of social media, isn't it? Anyway, what you see me doing here is laying out for Domino mortises. A domino is a machine that you can quickly cut little mortises, and then you can just use a fitted piece of wood to slip in there like a tenon. It's basically as strong as a mortise and tenon joint without the fiddling around trying to cut it and dial things in. It's just much quicker. And I have a domino, so I'm going to use it. We're going to do a dry assembly. I'm going to put a plywood back panel on this, so I'm going to dry assemble that, make sure everything fits, glue it up, then I'm going to router out and wrap it around the inside and fit the plywood panel to that. quick dry assembly here just to make sure everything fits. And then of course you see me showing off my domino again, or at least laying out for showing it off later. It's important to plan these showing off bits in advance. Here I'm doing a climb cut with the router, which is a backwards cut. As long as you're taking nice light passes and keeping control of your work, it's pretty safe. So here we've used the router, this rabbiting bit, cut out this rabbet here all the way around. Plywood back panel is going to sit in here and be glued into place. So what I'm doing here is making a template for putting some curves into the legs. Initially, as you can probably see here, I had a curve that went all the way from the top to the bottom. After I finished drawing it onto the piece, I realized that that might look a little funny, and so I modified it by taking the top edge of the curve off, and now it's just a single curve that tapers out and flares out at the bottom. That, of course, is the beautiful thing about making your own furniture, is you can choose to ruin it however you want to. Here, in order to maintain my square reference surfaces, I'm taping the offcuts back onto the piece. That way it's the same squareness as I run it through and cut off the rough parts. I'm cutting away most of the waste with a bandsaw, just because it's quicker, easier, makes less dust. It's also easier on the router. There's a variety of ways that you can attach something to a template. You can use clamps, you can use double-sided tape, you can screw it there if you have the waste. I found that this tape and super glue and activator works really well. It holds things nice and solid, and yet it's still easy to get off when you need to pull it off. Another good benefit is huffing the activator really gives you a great headache afterwards. So now these are all tapered, and now I need to shape this bottom so it has a bit of a foot going out at an angle. In order to get the proportions of things exactly wrong, it's really important and critical, in fact, to use some layout lines. That way you can get things cut right to the line, and then it's too late to realize you made a mistake. If you want to check out how to make one of these wonderful spokeshaves for yourself, as you can see they're very precise and quality tools, you can check out this video up in the cards there. So following a template with a router bit always leaves a little bit of a curve, but you can use a chisel to clean that up really easy. So here we go. All dry assembled. So the web frames are the part that the drawers sit on and kind of hold the whole carcass square. So they are important to make sure that they're milled up just right. So of course what you do is you run it through the jointer, that flattens it off, run it through the planer, that makes it parallel, then you run it through the table saw, and hopefully in the end you have something that's just perfectly off so it messes everything up. You may be asking yourself, why use a stop block and not just the fence? The reason is, having a narrow piece like that trapped between the blade and the fence is a recipe for kickback. That little stop block gives you enough of a space that there's no tension created between something binding the blade and the table saw fence. It's just a little bit safer. Remember, checking for square is critical to ensuring that things don't quite fit right. I have to put those web frames in for the drawers to rest on, and then start making the drawers, and then it'll be practically finished. Let's get on with that. It seems like 90% of woodworking is putting things together and then taking them apart. So it's super critical to have clamps that are just a little difficult to take apart to add that extra level of frustration to the whole process. My preferred method of glue removal is to wait until it's a lot harder than that. That way when you're trying to clean it off with a chisel, it tears out some wood and leaves little gaps and stuff as well. It adds to that handmade authenticity. I'm just making sure the first web frame is square, plum, apricot, whatever. Then I'm going to use spacers to reference the rest of the web frames off of that. So this one has to be perfect. And again, here's another opportunity to show off the fact that I have a domino. Here again, you see me using a spacer. Again, with the exact measurement doesn't matter as long as everything is consistent. So I'm going to use this same spacer all the way around to put the dominoes in for the bottom web frame. Then I cut a pair of spacers at exactly the same width that all of the other web frames will rest on. And again, I'll use the domino to reference off of those, and everything will be nice and consistent and square relative to itself. So there we all fit together and ready to pull apart. Sand up to 220 and put some finish on. After sanding, I masked off the areas that I'm going to have glue on. That way I can just slop on the finish, and when I glue it together, I can come back with a chisel and just clean off the glue. Now, the video is sped up for this part of the glue up. However, with a complex glue up like this, it really feels like you have to move this fast. So as you can see, drawer fronts are kind of cut to fit a bit of a gap above these. That's because my material wasn't quite wide enough. So the solution I came up with is to do an integrated drawer pull made out of wood that kind of comes out and has a bit of a curve. So that's the next thing to build. The material not being quite wide enough is a direct result of that change in decision. Rather than painting it, I decided to leave it wood, and as a result I wanted to use that wood, and it wasn't wide enough. However, I think this solution turned out pretty cool. So in order to cut a cove on a table saw, what you do is you put an auxiliary fence at an angle to your table saw blade. This particular angle is about 15 degrees. Again, the critical details is not the specific angle, but that you have it kind of within that range. And then as you can see, as you raise the table saw blade up, it cuts a cove into the wood. Then, using the table saw, I rip off most of the waste and then use my hand tools to refine it and then sand it nice and smooth. If anybody's interested in how to cut coves like this, Bourbon Moth does a great tutorial. If you're interested, in me making one, just leave a comment below and I will go ahead and make one. So once I'm done cutting them, I'll clean up the curves on the Mighty Rigid oscillating belt sander, and then we'll test fit it and see how it goes. And of course by test fitting, I test fitted it, and now you get to watch the satisfying glue up footage. So I'll quickly clean the waste off with the bandsaw, then flush trim it with flush trim bit, and clean it up a little bit with my hand plane. So what we have going on here, this is the material I have milled up for the drawer sides. So now we're going to cut it to length, cut the sides out, we'll run it through the table saw, cut the groove in for the bottom panel, and assemble it, and then we're done! Again, with not knowing what the exact measurement is, if you're referencing the piece from the actual piece, it's much more accurate than trying to measure it, because that accumulated air is what will screw you over in the end. Originally I was going to dovetail these in, however, because of the amount of flattening and work that I had to do to get this material appropriate for using, it was a little thin in my opinion for dovetails, or at least for half-blind dovetails like this, so I decided to use a pinned rabbet like this. Works pretty good, it's not going to come apart. One more opportunity to show off the Domino while I'm making some buttons to hold the top down. The reason you use buttons like this is to allow for wood movement of the solid panel. Birch in particular expands quite a bit, and so having those little buttons there allows it to move back and forth without racking the case or splitting or breaking apart. And thanks for watching. We made it to the end. If you made it this far, I've obviously not offended you greatly, so why not subscribe, leave a comment, hit like, all that jazz, and thank you for watching.